What if I told you? There was once a man so feared by the most powerful king in Europe that the monarch vowed not only to kill him, but to erase every trace of his existence. A man whose courage on the battlefield became such a threat that his death had to be turned into a national spectacle of humiliation and horror. This is not legend. This is the true story of William Wallace, the Scottish knight. Hollywood turned into a romantic hero, but whose real final hours were far darker than the movies dared show. Hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started with the disturbing truth of how the English crown transformed one man's execution into an unforgettable theater of cruelty. Forget the clean, noble death you've seen on screen. In August 1305, the streets of London became the stage for one of the most brutal public killings in recorded history. This was not just punishment, it was propaganda designed by King Edward I Longshanks to annihilate not only Wallace's body, but the idea of Scottish defiance itself. The execution method chosen, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was the medieval equivalent of psychological warfare, a process so violent and so public that it would lodge itself into the minds of every witness, every rumor, and every whispered story for generations. To understand why Wallace met such an end, we must first step into a Scotland caught between rebellion and surrender. In the late 13th century, the kingdom was fractured, its nobles torn between loyalty to their own land and survival under English domination. Wallace was no prince. He was a minor landowner whose family suffered under English occupation. The burning of his rage began at Stirling Bridge in 1297, when he defied all odds and crushed an English army, proving that the invincible knights of the crown could be brought down by cunning and courage. But Edward I was not a ruler to tolerate humiliation. This was the same king who had crushed Welsh resistance and expelled the Jews from England, a man who understood that rebellion was a fire that, if not extinguished utterly, would spread. Wallace's defiance was more than a military victory. It was a spark threatening to ignite all of Scotland. For Longshanks, it wasn't enough to defeat him in battle. He needed to destroy the man in such a way that even the memory of his rebellion would taste like ashes in the mouth. By 1305, most of the Scottish aristocracy had bent the knee to Edward, preferring submission over annihilation. Wallace's refusal to do the same made him both an enemy to England and an embarrassment to his own country's nobility. His capture became a priority. Edward's bounty on Wallace's head was a king's ransom enough to tempt even the loyal into betrayal. And in the end, betrayal came not from the English, but from within Scotland's own ranks. In August of that year, near Glasgow, Wallace was taken likely due to the treachery of Sir John Menteith, a fellow knight who had already made his peace with the English crown. The details are debated, but the result was indisputable. The symbol of Scottish resistance was shackled, humiliated, and paraded before those who once looked to him as a hero. His journey south to London was itself a slow-motion dismantling of his dignity, each stop another chance for the English to display their prize. Imagine the road south days of travel under guard, the rattle of chains, jeering crowds at every town, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies pressed together just to see the infamous rebel. To the English commoner, this was entertainment. To the authorities, it was a warning. To Wallace, it was the beginning of the end, a living death before the final act. And yet through it all, his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if looking beyond the humiliation toward something no one else could see. When Wallace arrived in London, the capital bristled with anticipation. His trial at Westminster Hall on August 23rd was a performance, not a pursuit of justice. The charges, treason, murder, sacrilege, were read in Latin, a language Wallace may not have understood. When given the chance to speak, he declared he could not be guilty of treason against a king he had never sworn allegiance to. It was defiance to the last, but the outcome had been scripted long before he entered the hall. The sentence was ceremonial in its gravity, each stage dripping with symbolism. He would be drawn through the streets to his place of execution, the dragging a mark of utter disgrace. He would be hanged until nearly dead, then cut down. He would be disemboweled alive, his entrails burned before his eyes to strip him of his humanity. Finally, he would be beheaded and quartered, his remains scattered to the winds of the realm. This was annihilation, not death, the deliberate erasure of a man. On the morning of his execution, London awoke to the closest thing medieval England had to a public holiday. Scaffolds were built, vendors prepared to sell meat pies, and ale families brought children to watch. From the tower, Wallace was lashed to a wooden hurdle and dragged across the cobbles, the stones tearing his flesh, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. The route was carefully chosen to pass through the busiest markets, maximizing the number of eyes that would see a hero reduced to prey. And the worst, the truly unthinkable, still waited for him at Smithfield. At Smithfield, the crowd was already a living wall, pressing in on every side, the air heavy with heat and the mingled sense of sweat ale and anticipation. This was England's theater, and Wallace was the unwilling star. Above him loomed the scaffold, not merely a place of execution, but a stage designed to ensure that no gesture, no scream, no drop of blood would be missed. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders for a better view, their eyes wide unaware that what they were about to see would burn itself into their memories for life. The executioner stepped forward, a man whose work was infamous but essential in the eyes of the crown. His tools gleamed in the sunlight, each blade honed for a specific purpose. Wallace was hauled upright, the coarse rope looped around his neck. The knot was placed not to snap his spine in a swift mercy, but to strangle him slowly, letting every heartbeat be a struggle. As the platform trap released, his body dropped and the world narrowed to a crushing noose, a roaring in the ears, a desperate gasp that would not come. His legs kicked against the wooden frame boots, scraping muscles, straining. The crowd leaned forward, savoring the sight of the rebel's face turning dark, his lips paling to blue, his eyes bulging with the effort to cling to life. It was a performance in itself, the dance of asphyxiation that some cheered, others watched in awed silence. Just when the blackness was about to claim him, the executioner's hand sliced through the rope, and Wallace collapsed onto the boards, alive but barely. There was no pause, no chance to catch breath. The executioner's knife flashed, and with practiced precision he slit open the skin of Wallace's abdomen. The crowd surged, desperate to see. Gasps rose, followed by a horrified cheer, as the first loops of entrails slid into view. Wallace, impossibly, was still conscious. His eyes flickered toward the horizon, refusing to acknowledge the man disassembling him piece by piece. And then came the true cruelty, each organ lifted high for all to see, then flung into a roaring fire at the side of the scaffold. The smell hit first a dense, oily smoke laced with the coppery tang of fresh blood. People covered their noses with kerchiefs, yet many still stared transfixed as if unable to look away. In medieval thought, the bowels were the seat of compassion and emotion. Burning them before the victim's eyes was more than a physical act. It was the symbolic destruction of the man's soul, a declaration that not even his humanity would be allowed to survive. Some witnesses would later claim that Wallace tried to speak during this ordeal, though what words he formed have been lost to time. Others swore he remained utterly silent, denying his captors the satisfaction of a scream. Either way, the executioner's grim skill kept him balanced on the razor's edge between life and death, prolonging the moment until even the most hardened spectators began to shift uncomfortably, realizing they were watching not justice but something far darker. When the knife finally stilled, it was almost a mercy. The axe was brought forth its edge, catching the light like a sliver of winter sun. One clean stroke, and Wallace's head rolled free, the roar of the crowd swelling as the executioner held it aloft. Crimson still dripping from the severed neck. For a heartbeat, the square seemed to freeze, one man's life reduced to a grisly trophy. But the performance was not over. The body, limp and cooling, was methodically quartered arms and legs, separated from the torso with measured strikes, each piece displayed to the crowd as though carved for a butcher's stall. The crowd's noise rose and fell with every severed limb, a grotesque rhythm marking the final dismantling of the man who had defied a king. Preservation was the next step in this ritual of domination. The head was dipped into tar, the thick black liquid coating hair and skin, sealing it against decay. Soon, it would be mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, where travelers from every corner of the realm would see it and remember the cost of rebellion. The 4 quarters of his body were assigned destinations: Newcastle Barrack, Stirling, and Perth. Each city a chosen warning to its own people. And so, the remains of William Wallace became a grisly map of English power, each fragment a silent sentinel over a subdued population. To Edward the Wand, it was mission accomplished, a rebel, extinguished, a symbol broken. But in the whispers of markets, in the murmurs of taverns, in the quiet prayers of Scotland's hills, the story began to shift. The man who had died in pieces was already being rebuilt in memory, not as a defeated criminal, but as a martyr whose defiance outlived his body. In the immediate days after the execution, London was still buzzing. Merchants spoke of it to customers as though recounting a grand festival, embellishing details to make the horror more palatable or more thrilling depending on their audience. But further north, in the taverns of Edinburgh and the farmsteads of the Highlands, the tone was different. There, his death was told in hushed voices, the brutality emphasized not to entertain, but to warn and to ignite a deeper, quieter fury. Edward Dwyer had intended the spectacle to be a master stroke of control, the kind of display that would lodge terror deep into the marrow of any who dared dream of independence. And for a moment it worked. Some Scottish nobles hastened to reaffirm their loyalty to the English crown. Others slipped into silence, calculating that no cause was worth the rope, the knife, and the axe. But beneath that silence, something began to shift, a realization that such cruelty was not strength but weakness, wearing armor. One of those who took note was Robert the Bruce, not yet king, but already a man with ambitions that stretched beyond compromise. Accounts suggest he was deeply affected by Wallace's fate, not out of pity alone, but because he saw in it the true face of English rule. This was not an authority to be bargained with, it was a force to be resisted utterly and without illusion. Wallace's torn body became the seed of a new, more relentless phase of the struggle. Beyond Scotland, word of the execution spread across Europe. In the courts of France, Aragon and the Low Countries' ambassadors whispered about England's justice. Some were impressed by the king's decisiveness. Others saw only barbarity, a sign that the English crown would go to any lengths to secure its will. The reputation of Edward the Feared as a ruler of iron was reinforced, but so too was the impression that he ruled by fear alone, and fear, as history has shown, is a brittle foundation. In monasteries and scriptoria, monks set quill to parchment recording the event in chronicles. The English accounts spoke clinically of the charges, the sentence, the execution, a neat procession of cause and effect. The Scottish versions were fewer but richer in emotion, painting Wallace not as a defeated rebel, but as a man who faced the unimaginable without surrendering his cause. Over time, these writings would feed a national memory that no display of power could fully extinguish. The trial records kept in the English archives revealed something chilling in their precision. Every stage of the punishment had been ordered in advance, from the route of the procession to the cities that would receive his quartered remains. There was no improvisation, no outburst of uncontrolled rage, only the cold, deliberate machinery of a state determined to make an example. That bureaucratic neatness made the cruelty all the more disturbing. For the people of Scotland, the sight of a tarred head on London Bridge or a severed limb displayed in their own marketplace was a daily reminder of subjugation. Parents pointed them out to children not as curiosities but as warnings. This is what happens when you rise too high. Yet, even those warnings carried an unintended consequence. They kept Wallace's name alive, etching his story into young minds that might otherwise have forgotten him. Months turned into years, and the physical remnants of Wallace's body decayed or were discarded, but the story refused to die. It traveled along the same roads his chained body had once been dragged down, carried in song and whispered in the dark corners of inns. With each retelling, the edges of the tale sharpened, the defiance became clearer, and the horror of the execution more potent. In the minds of the people, Wallace was no longer just a man. He was becoming a symbol. Symbols, once born, are difficult to kill. Edward's intention had been to destroy Wallace so completely that even the thought of rebellion would be poisoned. Instead, he had planted the seeds of a legend. In time, poets and balladeers would raise his image higher than any scaffold could reach, shaping him into a figure larger than life, a man whose courage and suffering embodied the cause of a nation. And yet behind the growing legend, the truth remained: the final hours of William Wallace were a calculated act of state terror, crafted not merely to punish but to instruct. Every scream suppressed, every wound inflicted, every fragment of his body displayed was part of a performance aimed at controlling not just the present, but the memory of the future. It was history as weapon, and in this case the weapon turned in the king's hand. In the years that followed, England's grip on Scotland wavered. Rebellions flared, sometimes quickly extinguished, sometimes burning longer than expected. Each new uprising carried with it echoes of Wallace's death, the knowledge that capture meant not just the end of life, but a descent into ritualized agony. For many fighters, this knowledge didn't deter them, it steeled them. Better to die in the clash of steel than to face the slow theater of humiliation the English had perfected. Among the common folk stories of Wallace's bravery began to fuse with older Celtic myths. In some tellings, he was not fully mortal but touched by something ancient and untamed, explaining why he could fight with such ferocity and endure so much pain without breaking. The line between history and legend blurred, but in the weaving of those tales lay a truth: the human need to transform unbearable suffering into something meaningful. Edward the Foon, for all his strategic brilliance, underestimated the resilience of memory. His campaign to subdue Scotland was military, political, and psychological. But while swords can break armies and laws can bind rulers, memory belongs to the people. And in the streets of Edinburgh, in the glens and highlands, that memory carried not the fear he intended, but a stubborn pride. Even in England, not all who saw the execution came away convinced it was justice. Some chroniclers admitted cautiously that the display had been excessive. One account from a London merchant's wife described how she left the square before the beheading, unable to stomach the smell or the sight. "If this be justice," she wrote, "then it is a cruel thing." Such dissent was dangerous to voice openly, but its quiet existence hints at cracks in the spectacle's intended effect. Over time, the sight of Wallace's execution at Smithfield took on layers of meaning. For the English crown, it remained a symbol of royal authority. For the Scots, it was hallowed ground, though tainted with blood. Travelers from the north would sometimes pause there, not openly in mourning, but lingering long enough to honor a memory they dared not speak aloud in enemy territory. The tarred head on London Bridge endured the longest, a blackened sentinel over the Thames. Merchants and foreign envoys passed beneath it, some glancing up with curiosity, others with unease. The bridge itself became part of the story, a place where power was displayed in its most visceral form. To the young, it was a warning, to the bitter, a challenge. In Scotland, poets began to commit his deeds to verse-crafting songs that carried far across the land. These were not polished works for noble courts, but raw ballads meant to be remembered and repeated. Each verse was a piece of resistance, keeping alive not only the memory of Wallace's fight, but the indignity of his end. The English could scatter his body, but they could not scatter the rhythm of a song. The brutality of Wallace's execution also began to filter into military thinking. Scottish commanders understood that surrender to the English would lead to horrors beyond the battlefield. This hardened their resolve and shifted tactics: more raids, more ambushes, fewer open battles where capture was possible. The war became not just for land, but for the right to die on one's own terms. As decades passed, Wallace's story became a kind of touchstone in arguments about justice and cruelty. Clerics and scholars debated whether such punishments were truly godly or merely the indulgence of human vengeance. In these debates, his name was often invoked, sometimes as an example of divine judgment, sometimes as proof that earthly kings could sin against the dignity of man. Edward III himself would not live to see the full consequences of that August day in 1305. His death came in 1307 while Scotland still resisted. But his legacy in part was the memory of Wallace's execution, a memory that would haunt English-Scottish relations for centuries. For every tale told in England of the rebel who got his due, there was another in Scotland of the patriot who died unbroken. By the mid-14th century, Wallace's execution had taken on an almost mythic status in Scottish identity. Children who had never seen his face could still describe the day of his death in vivid detail, because the tale had been told so many times it felt like memory. The imagery, the dragging through the streets, the fire consuming his entrails, was no longer just history. It had become a shared wound, inherited like a family heirloom. In villages far from the centers of power, the story was adapted to suit local pride. Some claimed Wallace came from their own region. Others insisted a relative had fought beside him. These personal claims tied communities more tightly to the legend, giving them a sense of ownership over his martyrdom. It was as though sharing in his suffering gave them a fragment of his defiance. English chroniclers continued to record his execution as a warning for future rebels, but even in their telling, a reluctant respect sometimes surfaced. Phrases like, "He met his death steadfastly," or "He did not plead for life," slipped into the records, undermining the attempt to paint him as a mere criminal. In trying to make him small, they had inadvertently helped to make him great. Travelers from continental Europe brought the story back to their homelands, where it was received with a mixture of horror and fascination. In France, some poets compared Wallace to classical heroes betrayed by their own people. In Flanders, merchants whispered his name as an example of what could happen if one resisted a greater power, and also as an example of why one should. The religious interpretation of Wallace's death began to grow in certain circles. Some priests spoke of him in the language reserved for saints, not for his piety, but for his endurance in the face of torment. In their sermons, his suffering became a moral example not of rebellion, but of steadfastness in one's convictions even under the threat of the most grievous bodily harm. Centuries later, as methods of execution became less spectacular and more hidden from public view, Wallace's ordeal seemed even more alien and shocking. Readers of history books struggled to comprehend how thousands could have gathered to cheer as a man was torn apart. This distance in time only deepened the fascination, making his death a grim window into a world where cruelty was entertainment. In Scotland, the anniversary of his execution began to be marked quietly in some towns. There were no official ceremonies, the political risk was too high, but candles were lit in windows, prayers were whispered, and certain songs were sung only in trusted company. It was a defiance of silence, a refusal to let the date pass unnoticed. The places that had displayed his body parts carried their own burden of memory. In Newcastle, old market-goers claimed that, for years, no one wanted to set up a stall on the spot where his quarter had hung. In Stirling, People swore the rains fell harder in the months after his remains arrived, as though the sky itself was mourning. London Bridge, where his head had been mounted, became almost a site of pilgrimage for Scots living in or passing through the city. They would pass beneath it without looking up, refusing to give the English the satisfaction of seeing their reaction. But in their hearts, each one carried an image of what had been done and why. The more the English tried to define Wallace's death as a triumph of royal justice, the more it became in Scotland's memory an indictment of that same justice. Over time, it was not just the man who was remembered, but the cruelty of the system that had destroyed him. In this way, the execution continued to work against the very purpose for which it had been staged. As the centuries rolled on, Wallace's death began to appear in art, woodcuts, illuminated manuscripts, and later oil paintings. In these depictions, the gruesome details were often softened or symbolized, but the essence remained a proud figure standing against the full might of the English crown. The artists knew their audience. They painted him not as a victim, but as a man who faced horror with unshakable will. In ballads passed from bard to bard, the sounds of that day were preserved: the clatter of the wooden hurdle dragging over cobblestones, the roar of the crowd, the sizzle of flesh over the executioner's fire. These details, sung in dimly lit taverns, made listeners feel as though they had been there, pressed shoulder to shoulder among the spectators, witnessing the moment when a man's body became a political message. The story also entered the realm of cautionary tale. Parents would use it to warn their children about the dangers of challenging authority, while rebels in waiting took from it the opposite lesson, that some causes were worth any price. The execution became a mirror reflecting the values of whoever told it, whether those values were submission or defiance. Even in England, some began to regard Wallace's end as excessive, especially as the ideals of justice evolved. Legal scholars of later generations cited his case as an example of punishment crossing the line into spectacle, where the aim was not merely to enforce law, but to dominate the spirit. This academic debate ensured that Wallace's name lived on in places the English crown might have preferred it vanish. In Scotland's collective memory, Wallace's mutilation was never just about one man. It was about the arrogance of a system that believed it could frighten a people into permanent obedience. The scaffold at Smithfield became a symbol not of English victory, but of the cruelty that defined their occupation. Every retelling kept that bitterness alive. Over the generations, his execution influenced the tactics of Scottish resistance in subtle but lasting ways. Leaders were more careful to avoid capture, knowing what awaited them. Raids became swifter ambushes, more precise, and loyalty tested more fiercely. The lesson of Wallace was clear: if the enemy takes you alive, they will take more than your life. Religious thinkers, too, continued to wrestle with the moral weight of his death. Some compared his silence under torture to that of martyrs from the early church. Others saw in it the darker lesson of how faith and patriotism could be twisted to justify any atrocity depending on who told the story. In both readings, Wallace remained central, a figure whose suffering demanded interpretation. In times of political unrest, his name would resurface like a spark in dry grass. Leaders would invoke him in speeches, rebels would scrawl his name on walls, and poets would return to his story for inspiration. Each generation shaped him to fit their own struggle, but the core of the tale, defiance, cruelty, endurance, never changed. By the time Scotland entered the modern era, Wallace's execution had become more than an event in history. It was a national symbol, a thread woven through the fabric of identity. The details of the execution were still told with the same sensory horror: the dragging, the hanging, the disembowelment, the quartering. They were kept vivid for a reason: to remind the living what was once done to one of their own. And yet, even with the passing centuries, one truth remained as sharp as the axe that severed his head: the attempt to destroy Wallace had failed. His body was scattered, but his story endured. What Edward Wine had intended as a warning became a rallying cry. The king had sought to close a chapter. Instead, he had written the first lines of a legend. In the final reckoning, Wallace's death revealed something profound about the nature of power. Kings could command armies, enforce laws, and order executions, but they could not dictate the meaning people drew from an event. Edward the First had authored a scene of horror to frighten Scotland into submission. Scotland chose instead to remember it as a testament to unbroken will. That defiance in memory was its own quiet rebellion. Some historians would later write that Wallace's true victory came not at Stirling Bridge, but on the scaffold at Smithfield. There, stripped of armor, weapons, and any hope of survival, he still denied his captors the one thing they wanted most, his surrender. Whether he stayed silent or spoke defiantly, the effect was the same, the image of a man who met unimaginable pain without betraying his cause. In the centuries that followed, every retelling of his story carried with it the sensory imprint of that day, the sound of the wooden hurdle scraping along stone, the rasp of the rope, the hiss of the fire. These details were passed down not to glorify suffering, but to keep the memory sharp, to ensure it could not be smoothed over by time or by the victor's version of history. Smithfield itself would go on to witness many other executions, but none would leave so deep a mark on the Scottish consciousness. The ground where Wallace fell became in memory almost a battlefield, the place where one man faced an empire and refused to bow. No monument marked it, but in the hearts of those who remembered it stood as tall as any stone tower. As Scotland's political fortunes rose and fell through the ages, Wallace's name surfaced whenever the nation sought to define itself. In moments of unity, he was a symbol of shared pride. In times of division, he was a reminder of what could be achieved when personal grievances were set aside for a greater cause. His execution was no longer just an ending. It was a touchstone for what it meant to resist. In literature, Wallace became a canvas for the values of each era. Romantic poets painted him as a lone hero against impossible odds. Nationalist writers cast him as the father of Scottish liberty. Even in works critical of rebellion, his courage was acknowledged as if some part of his story resisted distortion, standing firm against the pressure of interpretation. Modern historians, sifting through the trial records and chronicles, have pointed out the calculated nature of every step of his execution. It was not the chaotic cruelty of a mob, but the precise cruelty of the state and organized ritual meant to send a message. Ironically, that precision preserved the details so well that the story survived intact for over 700 years. Today, the idea of such a public execution feels alien, even monstrous, to much of the world. But in remembering it, we are reminded how thin the line can be between civilization and brutality, how quickly justice can become spectacle when those in power see fear as the surest means of control. Wallace's fate warns us that cruelty, once normalized, can be embraced by ordinary people without question. And so, Wallace endures not as a relic of medieval politics, but as a living challenge to the present. His story asks whether we would have the courage to stand as he did, knowing the price, knowing the end would come, not as a clean death, but as a prolonged destruction meant to erase us entirely. It is an uncomfortable question, but that is why it matters. In the end, the blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval London still echo, if only in the imagination. They whisper of a man dragged, hanged, cut, and scattered, yet never truly defeated. His execution, meant to be the final word, became instead the first line of a legend that refuses to die. And as long as that legend is told, the warning Edward intended will never be the one the world remembers.